Welcome to the CPOST 2020 election special with Professor Robert Pape and Paul Poast and myself, Rod Cowan. So good morning, Paul.
Well, good morning, Rod. How are you? Of course, it's not morning for you, right?
No, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and so I haven't lost any sleep over the election at all. How about you?
It wasn't the most restful night's sleep, but I did get a good night's sleep largely because, I followed the early results and then just kind of recognized that it was going to take a while and said, you know what, we just got to go to bed and see what happens here. But, I'm looking forward to talking about what is happening and happening by the minute.
Okay, you made a bold prediction, Paul. And I just wondered, I was going to play it. I was going to call up your podcast because technically we can do that. But I thought, no, I'd just get you to say your bold prediction again and compare it to what's happening this morning, please.
Sure. So my bold prediction. I made a prediction. I said Biden would win. My bold prediction was that Biden would win by a convincing amount, a landslide, right? And he'd win so convincingly that Donald Trump would then say, well, forget it. You all don't need me. You're a bunch of losers. And then just quit. And then he'd just leave. So that was my bold prediction was, a landslide Biden victory, very convincing. It would be done Friday night. Florida would go to him, Texas, all that. But the more realistic prediction, and one I posted actually on Twitter yesterday, was just that Biden would win. And most everything was pointing towards Biden winning. It was within the realm of possibility that he could win by a landslide. It was also within the realm of possibility that it would take time and the results would slowly come in and people would have to wait. And that's exactly what we're seeing it taking time. But with each minute, it's seeming like the result of Biden winning and not just squeaking it out. I think he's, he seems to be on pace to win Wisconsin, Michigan, probably Pennsylvania, even Georgia, to where that would actually put his margin of victory in the Electoral College above 2000, 2004, 2016, put him close to 2012 with Obama. So, it's not going to be a landslide, but as these results are coming in, it is looking like he's going to have more than just simply a squeaking out victory.
Professor Pape, how did you sleep last night?
Actually, I slept like a baby, just like Paul. So I went to bed at 9:30. I saw where this was heading and got up about 5:30. And sure enough, it was what I thought, which is we're still in the we still don't know for sure. I agree with Paul's assessment that things are heading in Biden's direction if the votes are counted. And I think the not so big surprise was that Trump already declared victory and has already signaled that he won't accept anything less, which of course is a dog whistle to the Proud Boys and a bunch of other folks. So we are heading to the unfortunately the dangerous scenario is right in front of us. That unfortunately has been the main scenario to worry about for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and we're here.
Walk us through yesterday. What were you seeing yesterday, Professor?
Well, what I've been seeing for the last week or so is a very large Trump rallies that have created an enormous amount of momentum. And this right away told me that completely discount the polls here, because the polls, we know, make estimates about who's going to be a likely voter. And if you have massive new turnout as a result of massive new rallies, then that already is going to create such havoc with polling that you're just not going to, it's not going to be reliable. But more than that, the numbers started to come in where Trump's rallies were 57,000, and this was happening over and over and over again. So these were not tiny little rallies here. And so, and what you got, well, you got pictures of this going national as well. So the amount of mobilization and momentum here on the part of Trump has been really, truly huge. So there are likely millions of Trump supporters now that are very, very mobilized here. And that's happened in addition to the many millions who've been mobilized on the left over the summer. So you put that together, the mass mobilization, and now the uncertainty about the election, which is going to go on for certainly days here in terms of counting, probably weeks, and Trump's already declaring victory. You add all that up, and what you have is a danger zone where we have the possibility of real violence over the next several weeks, probably several months.
Paul, one of your interests is polls and how polls work. What's gone wrong with the polls here?
I don't think anything's gone wrong with the polls. I think that there's definitely, I mean, I think there are some results that are a little bit more surprising than what pollsters were hoping for, in terms of like Florida being a little bit more surprising. However, Florida was also a state that was considered very close, toss-up state. And indeed, if you look at the electoral map right now where they're not calling, these are all the states that were expected to be close: North Carolina, Georgia, also Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These were also places where it was known ahead of time that there would be a lot of votes coming in later. This was, in fact, I think it was 538 that had even posted that it was very likely. They posted this maybe a week or so ago where it was likely that Trump would be up by as much as 16 percentage points on the night of the election in Pennsylvania. But then as these votes started to be counted, he would eventually, that lead would erode, and then Biden would end up winning the state by maybe 3%. So, and that seems to be where things are heading. So yeah, I actually I will say this: if Trump won, and it's still possible he could win by, setting aside for a moment at least the concerns that Bob raised. But if Trump were just to win the vote outright, I think then you would have a lot of folks who study methodology, a lot of folks who study polling, a lot of folks who study political forecasting who would really have to reassess things. Because with 2016, you could sit there and say, well, there was a 30%, 538 put a 30% chance on Trump winning. That's not an unlikely event. And sure enough, it happened. But if you keep consistently putting the lower probability on the event that actually happens, then you need to start rethinking your models. And so if they came out and said, oh, there's only a 10% chance of Trump winning, and then he wins, and you can say, well, sure, 10% chance events happen. It's like, but eventually your models have to start putting more probability on the thing that's actually going to happen. But again, as these results are coming in, it's looking like the thing that was expected to happen from the poll standpoint is going to happen. Now, again, we could talk more about kind of the aftermath. I have a slightly more optimistic view about things than Bob does, but that's not to say that Bob's view is unrealistic, because it is a legitimate concern that folks have.
Okay, well, Bob, what's your take on polls? I mean, apart from entertainment value, finding people on landlines doesn't seem like a very good way of working nowadays.
Well, I think whether you look at 538, we look at Real Clear Politics, or you look at CNN polls or Fox polls, a week and a half ago, what we saw was something verging on a landslide victory here for Biden. We also saw this with high expectations that the Democrats would easily win the Senate. So as Biden was going to win, so did a lot of the expectations for the Senate. And I think what you've seen last night is not, I agree with Paul that you may still end up with a Biden victory. I think that looks, in fact, I would say, 60-40 likely. But I think that now it's a narrow victory. So what happened in the polls is a swing from, I think, a large blue wave here to a narrow Biden victory. And it may turn out that as we fully count the mail-ins and so forth over the next week, that we'll see a somewhat bigger blue wave. I think that is definitely possible. So I think the difference between Paul and I may not be huge, but at the same time, I do think that if you just look at where the Senate is here, this is really quite a challenge. And our pollsters here just are, they're providing not a whole lot of value as we go forward. I think there may be where the problem is. I think they're already starting to assess it. You can see in the morning papers that the problem of trying to identify the support of white non-college voters here seems to be a real problem. These are rural. These are folks who may or may not have landlines. They may or may not want to spoof the polls. But something is happening again with this particular group. And we already knew about that from 4 years ago. Many pollsters claim they had adjusted. We're just going to have to see, what we make of this in a week or two for polls. Polls, though, are a different story. That's looking at, backwards here at the election. I think the real issues now are just simply going forward here. So polls are kind of a fun thing to play with right now. They've always been kind of entertainment, but I don't think they're going to matter in terms of the big issues we have in front of us.
Paul, what's next? What's going to happen next?
Well, I mean, so Bob laid out one possible scenario, and Trump's words last night point to this. The reason why I'm not quite as concerned about the possibility of electoral violence is, first of all, we know from a lot of our research on it, and of course, Bob's very familiar with this, that the prospects of electoral violence become greater as the margin of victory is smaller. And as we continue to see these votes come in, it's one thing if Trump wants to challenge Pennsylvania. He wants to say, well, Pennsylvania, there's a problem. But it becomes another thing if he says, well, I want to challenge Pennsylvania, and I want to challenge Michigan, and I want to challenge Wisconsin, and I want to challenge Georgia, because Georgia could end up going this way. And then at that point, it starts to get a lot harder for him, especially since he, like right now, if he calls for another stoppage of the vote count, he's behind. So that's one factor that leads me to say I'm not sure of the grounds on which he could stand. If this was like a 2000 where it all came down to Florida type situation, then that would be different. So that's one reason why I'm not as concerned. The second reason I'm not as concerned is almost immediately after Trump made those comments last night, you had Vice President Pence essentially walk it back. You had Rick Santorum on CNN condemn the comments and just say, this is, basically say these are completely inappropriate comments. You had Fox News choose not to really play those up. And so I think that's another reason why I think there would be enough pushback to him making this call, making these claims for trying to throw the election to the courts. The final reason why is actually pointing to something that Bob was just talking about. I think the fact that the Republicans are winning the Senate give them another reason to just say, let's get this over with, right? We have the Senate. We've gotten what we need out of Trump. Let's not keep this thing in disarray. And, by having control of the Senate, we can control a lot of the agenda that we need to control. And so I think that that's another reason why you would actually see some Republicans who would just kind of say to Trump, no, let's back off on this. Let's back off. Now, that doesn't eliminate the possibility, and I think this is something that Bob's comments really highlight. This doesn't eliminate the possibility of some of these militia groups taking matters into their own hands, regardless of what Trump says, regardless of what Republicans say. And so you could possibly see that. But I am not quite as concerned about that today as I would have been maybe a few days ago.
So I have a different view on this. I think the first thing to do is to be a little more precise about what we mean by when we say that we're in a danger zone of violence. I think the key issue here is the rise of either individual or multiple armed groups. We've already seen an instance of this with the plot against Governor Whitmer in Michigan. And what we learned here is something that we have always known as scholars studying social movement violence, which is that those 13 individuals, the mobilization to actually plot violence started when they got together at lockdown rallies. So the rallies themselves were a stage one of what in social movement theory is called low risk mobilization, where people get together, they protest, and so forth. And what happened in this case was a clear instance where then after the lockdown rallies, those face-to-face meetings continued week after week after week with different subsets of what ultimately became 13 individuals planning to do some fairly serious violence. And they had done reconnaissance, they had tested IEDs, and so forth. So this was not a trivial plot. Well, that process, unfortunately, is not limited to just those 13 individuals. And so what you have seen over the last few months here is a mass mobilization through protests and rallies. And Rod, I don't know if you have the chart that I sent you earlier, if you can show Paul the chart. There it is. So what you see is with a research group starting in the summer, I've been tracking protests, every single protest that has occurred in the top 50 cities in the United States. This is tracking protests here. What you see on the chart is from when they're really beginning in late May and early June up through September. And what's really striking across these top 50 cities is the number of weeks of protests where there are protests during a week. And what you see is across all 50 here, virtually all 50, except for Mesa at the bottom, it's really impressive here. You're getting 8 weeks, you're getting 12 weeks. Jacksonville, which is a Republican, has a Republican mayor, is 12 weeks out of 20. And what you are seeing here is not just protests that occurred over a weekend with George Floyd. What you're seeing is mass mobilization that has continued week after week after week after week. Well, many of these people now know each other. I'm not telling you they have certainly started to organize for major violence. However, this is exactly the seeds of the transition to major violence that we're used to seeing when we study how social movements evolve into violence. And that's what you're seeing here. Now, if you marry that, if you could just imagine a similar chart of the Trump rallies over the last 2.5 weeks here, these are just massive mobilization here. And yes, they're peaceful now, but the fact is, this is what's planting the seeds, and they're both on the right and the left. And they're occurring in many, many places around the country, as is all the challenges here that Paul just pointed out for the voting. So you have opportunity after opportunity after opportunity with recounts, court challenges going on for weeks for different clashes and different problems to emerge. Now, I call this a danger zone. I'm not saying that violence is sure to happen. We don't have a crystal ball when it comes to violence here. It doesn't quite work that way. However, the pathways we are now seeing, we have seen many other places around the world. These are not unique. This is not weird when you study violence. And the difference is we're just not used to seeing this in the United States. Now, it still may not happen. There are good reasons to doubt. The biggest reason is we're rich. Rich countries normally don't go through this kind of violence. We're supposed to be a mature democracy where democracy is an off-ramp, or the elections are an off-ramp for violence. Well, in this case, we're seeing massive unemployment. We're seeing that's persistent. We're seeing the elections now, rather than an off-ramp, are becoming an on-ramp for violence. So this makes it impossible to say with certainty we're heading toward a violent outcome. However, the danger zone here, I think, is it is important, and I think it's quite wise of the cities here and the businesses to have taken precautionary steps that are expensive, that are surely pushing away business in order to take some steps here to ensure themselves against the possibility of real violence. And I'm just suggesting this is going to go on for weeks. So getting these counts here resolved in the normal way, unfortunately, unless Trump himself were to accept a peaceful transition of power, announce that he will step down smoothly and immediately and accept the results here, the danger zone is going to be there. He's done everything but that. He's done the opposite of that. And that's really, so you put the tinderbox I just laid in front of you with the matches that Trump keeps throwing on and the gasoline he keeps throwing on the tinderbox. Who's really going to be surprised here if things blow up? In hindsight, everybody will say they saw it coming, but right now the problem is the danger zone.
Okay, so Paul, in the few minutes we've got left, where do we go now? What happens next?
Well, I think we've touched on pretty well what's going to happen next domestically. And I think, we've laid out the possibilities that, we're going to continue to see the vote count. I actually think we'll have a lot more resolution today in terms of the actual vote count. That's not to set aside a lot of the potential for legal challenges and also violence. And I think Bob and I are in agreement on that there is the possibility, even though I think Trump himself will back down, because let's be honest, he has a track record of doing this. That doesn't eliminate the possibility for these groups to take things into their own hands, which is a lot of what I think Bob's speaking to. And so I think that possibility is there. So I think we talked quite a bit about the domestic. For me, I really want to think about what's the international implication. I think number one thing I talked about with this election is it could be read as a referendum on America First and America First policy. And regardless of the outcome, which I think it will be Biden, I think it'll be Biden by more than a squeaker, but not a landslide. I think there was enough support for Trump to say that this referendum did not reject America First policy. Now, of course, were voters going to the polls thinking about America First policy? Were they thinking about immigration policy? Were they thinking about support to NATO and international institutions? No, I don't think so. I think even the exit polls, and take for those what you will, but the exit polls were consistent with kind of the conventional wisdom. People were concerned about the economy. People are concerned about reactions and government policy towards the coronavirus. People are concerned about racial issues. So people are focused on domestic issues. And I think those ultimately were what drove the votes. But from a global perspective, you're going to look at this. If you're someone in any other country other than US, you're going to look at this result and say, that's not a rejection of an America First policy. And so that's not a good basis for a full reset, right? A full reset to Obama era policies. And, just yesterday on Twitter, I tweeted about how there's actually quite a bit of continuity in many of the big aspects of Trump's foreign policy compared to Obama. But the reality is, because of this election result, it's going to be very difficult for Biden to do a full reset.
From a European point of view, what we would expect is a more civilized and perhaps nuanced approach to that.
I think that is one thing you will see right away, right? In fact, I've joked many times about how Biden better get ready for a trip to Oslo. To pick up his Peace Prize. Though I think in the tweet yesterday, I real quick said, no, wait, they give the Peace Prize in Stockholm, not Oslo. But yeah, regardless, there's the possibility for another kind of Obama receiving the Peace Prize, largely because he wasn't Bush, right? And you could see a similar reaction of, oh, it's good to not have to worry about all caps tweets anymore. We can go ahead and focus on the real issues. The other area where there will be practical implications is Biden will fully staff the State Department, right? That this will not be a thing where you'll have a lot of interim this, acting that. You'll have people who are actually being staffed. And that's something that, from talking to several folks who follow European affairs on the diplomatic level, say like with NATO, they've said that the biggest changed with the Trump administration hasn't been with the big issues. It's like, even if you look at the overall trajectory, as much as Trump will complain about NATO, it's like the US is still taking a lot of policies that are very much pro NATO, that are in line with some of the repositioning of troops that's been kicked around for a while regarding NATO, trying to get NATO countries to spend more. Hasn't been so much the big issues, but it's been the small issues. It's been the day-to-day issues. They said that, this one individual talked about how typically prior to Trump, like every day on the day-to-day basis, there's Americans involved in the issues. And that just hasn't been the case. And I think a big reason why is because the State Department just hasn't been staffed. There haven't been people there to actually be involved on a day-to-day basis. So even though the big issues, there haven't been the major changes on some of these things from the European perspective, on the small day-to-day side, there has been. And I think that is something that could be immediately changed with a Biden administration.
How much longer before we know what the outcome actually is?
Well, we're going to know the first round of counting here in just a few days, but that's not going to be the outcome. We have already mandated by law December 14th, when the electors are supposed to present their votes in the Electoral College, and then January 6th, when Congress is supposed to certify those results. All of that period is opportunities for a contested election. And I think we need to plan on a contested election, certainly through January 6th, because you're seeing no signs here, especially if we're now predicting that Biden is likely to win. Well, there's no sign yet of Trump accepting defeat. He's just said he won't. And so what that means is contest. And so, unfortunately, I think we have a few months. And what that means is America will be inward looking for those few months. It's now even more apparently divided than even people realized. I think this is really the big wake up call this morning, which is that these aren't just, this wasn't a fluke in 2016. And so I think that what we are in ahead of us here is a very inward looking America. It's going to be, there's going to be issues of contest here going on for weeks. And this is unfortunately not going to be a normal. We're not heading toward a new normal. This won't make it easier to handle the virus. That won't make it easier to handle the economy. Here, a lot of those issues, the virus, the economy, they're all going to be confused because we're simply not going to know who's really the president of the United States here for some time.
I still am not totally throwing out the possibility that Donald Trump, following this, just decides to just leave, just like not even finish out the term. I still think that's a real possibility, which throws things into further chaos. That's not a like happy scenario per se, right? Because suddenly you're scrambling if that indeed happens. But thinking about this internationally, to me, thinking about what Bob was just talking about reminds me of back in 2000. So back in 2000, I was living in London, and I remember a host of people, not from the UK, some people from the UK, but people from all around the world who, watching what was unfolding with Bush versus Gore, were kind of like, so how's that whole democratic project working out for you? How's that whole like democracy promotion thing working out for you all? So it definitely was a blow. And until that thing was resolved, it very much complicated the ability for the US, not just to carry out policies, but to even have a perception of legitimacy with carrying out these policies. And then always hanging over Bush's head the fact that this election was unfolded that way. Now, I think 9/11 came along and kind of changed the narrative totally, right? I think you could play out a counterfactual where if there's no 9/11, the baggage of how the 2000 election ended would have continued to weigh down Bush and would have complicated his ability to be able to negotiate the international level, to be able to engage in the kind of policies. I mean, we already saw that anyways with the Iraq War, but the Iraq War was kind of another level. At least immediately following 9/11, there was a lot of support for the United States, and it kind of erased the perceptions of weakness, if you will, due to the election results. So that's something to be paying attention to, is if things progress for a long time, like Bob's talking about, that could have a similar effect. And heaven forbid, we have a 9/11 type event. We wouldn't want that. But absent that, you could see then a much longer term effect in terms of making countries more like wary of maybe negotiating and bargaining with the United States. This keeps going on.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up there. We'll obviously have to set another one of these chats so that we can talk about the new president of the United States and see how your predictions are going then. So thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Great being on, Paul. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Bob.